So, welcome back, friends. We just got done looking at the theory of psychological egoism, which again is a descriptive claim about human nature. It just says everything you've ever done and everyone else has ever done, they've done consciously because they thought it was in their best interest in the moment, at least, if not long term. Why is college? Why do we go to college? Well, probably because you think it's in your best interest. Why do you stay home? Probably because you think it's in your best interest. And so on and so forth. Well, someone came along and decided to make an ethical theory based off of this foundation, right? It says, well, if people cannot help but act in ways they believe to be in their self-interest, maybe we can make a moral theory that says the morally correct thing to do in any given situation is the one that actually is in their best interest. Yeah? People who are going to McDonald's 4 to 5 nights a week are justifying it to themselves. It's cheap, it's fast, it's expedient, it's been a hard day, it's been an easy day, whatever. And so they're doing it in the moment, but it's not actually in their best interest. Yeah? So why don't we make a moral theory that says the morally correct thing to do is whatever actually is in your best interest. Capiche? How well does this explain the rights and wrongs of the world? Take a moment, think about things that you think are good. Going to college, exercise, keeping good relationships up, telling the truth, being a law-abiding citizen, yada yada yada. Why are these things good? The moral theory says they're good because they're actually in your best interest. It's actually in your best interest to follow the laws. It's actually in your best interest to exercise, to read, to stay informed, to be a conscientious citizen, right? Whatever it is that you think is determines this. So take a minute, think about how well does this actually correlate with our own moral intuitions about the way the world works. Hopefully you've had a moment to think it through. Most cultures, most time periods do think that things like truth-telling and promise-keeping are good, right, moral, responsible. And the question is why? Why are these things moral? Why do we teach our children to tell the truth, to keep their promises? Sometimes, man, it's bloody well painful to keep your promises and tell the truth. Yeah? And sometimes it hurts. Sometimes you gotta burn in the fires of tribulation and trial and yada yada yada, if you know what I mean. But still, even after we've burned, we would probably still tell our children, who's the best litmus test I would offer of who a person really is, what they really value, to tell the truth and keep their promises. Ethical egoism, as a moral theory, says the reason telling the truth is good is because it's actually in your best interest long term. That the effects of telling the truth means you develop, maybe a character, right? Or it means people trust you and it's going to help you out in the long term. You want to be known as a trustworthy person. Or haven't you heard the story of the boy who cried wolf? And promise keeping is good even if it inconveniences you, even if you have to, put yourself out of sorts to keep that promise. Promise keeping is good and moral because it's actually in your best interests to keep your promises. That your life is better, you have better relationships, you trust yourself and others around you better, and they trust you better, right? You have more opportunities. This is what moral, and to a certain extent, I think that that's a pretty powerful and compelling explanation. Like, you're in college right now, right? I assume you are if you're watching this video, or you're just teaching yourself online. Is it a good and moral thing to go to college and educate yourself? Get a degree? Why? Ethical egoism says it's moral because it's actually in your self-interest to go to college. Now, one of the criticisms of ethical egoism is that it's hard to actually determine what is in your best interest in many cases. So, for instance, college is a good one. All of you are going to college because you think it's in your best interest. Now, that remains to be seen if it actually is in your best interest. There are many people who have gone deeply into debt to get a degree in something that either there was no job in the market for, so it basically put them into debt without any job prospects, or it was a degree in something that they didn't really want to do, or it was a degree in journalism when journalism's dying or completely going online, right? And so a lot of people have had to go back to college for different things. And so just because you think something is in your best interest, even something as clear as going to college and getting a degree, because often you have to put your work life aside, you have to take loans, yada, yada, yada. So you see how difficult it is to literally war game what is in your best interest. Yeah? Now that doesn't mean the theory isn't true, just because it's difficult to figure it out. It still might be that what's moral is what's actually in your best interest, right? Why is it good to save money and not spend more than we have? And not, go out late and burn the candle all the time? Because it's actually in your best interest. It's actually better for you, yeah? So, to a certain extent, you should find it pretty compelling, yeah, that here we have a moral theory that grounds itself. What's moral and good isn't what some, authority figure on high dictates to you, or what your culture dictates, or just what your feelings dictate. It's actually based on outcomes, right? If it's actually in your best interest. Why should you go to college and keep your promises and, exercise and build a future and save for retirement? Why is that good? Why do we advise people? Because it's actually in their best interest, because that's the highest quality of life, right? And that's what's moral. And why are neglecting yourself and being in abusive relationships and engaging in high-risk behavior and drugs and yada yada, why is that bad? Why is why is breaking the law? Because it's not actually in your best interest, because it's not going to produce the life that you want to have, yeah? So you can see it's got like a lot of thrust to it, yeah? And it's a moral theory, a normative claim that's based directly on top of the psychological claim, right? I think we made a pretty good case for how everything you do, for better or worse, you do because you think it's in your best interest, either long-term or immediate, right? Hit in one of those three categories every time, yeah? And so, why not build a moral theory that says what's moral is what's actually in your best interest, right? So, hopefully that's clear. Now, what problems do we find, or what do we dislike about ethical egoism as an ethical moral theory? Someone might say, well, ethical egoism appears to give priority to the individual over others, right? And shouldn't all ethical moral theories take into consideration others? It's a great question, right? Should you give more preference to the values and preferences of yourself and your self-interest than those of others? And to what extent? This is a fascinating field of study. And to a certain extent, it's the realm of distributive justice, which we will get to a little bit in this class. To what extent do you have autonomy and freedom in the world, and what do you owe yourself, and what do you owe others? Yeah. And even if you're a hardcore libertarian, right, just like, I have the right to live and I don't owe anyone anything, generally we do still think that we owe other people at least some principles of non-interference, right? You can't just go murder and kill them, right? Like a Thomas Hobbes state of nature. But an ethical egoist will have to address whether they can account for the violation of other people's rights, or whether ethical egoism does seem to just justify anything that ends up actually being in a person's self-interest. So just to recap, it is somewhat problematic that ethical egoism is a theory that gives priority to self over others. It says, yeah, you owe yourself more than you owe strangers down the road or around the world, or that you can give priority to those people who are in your immediate surroundings, which to a certain extent is, I think, consistent with our moral intuitions. we tend to spend our time thinking more about the people who are in our proximity, family, friends, coworkers, etc., right? Then we, I mean, some of us, we keep our ears to the sufferings going around the world, but we still focus on those things that are immediate to us. And do we have good reason for that or not? I mean, this is a good question, because the universalizing of moral principles is important, right? We want something to apply, but how we do that, right? I mean, and so soon after this, we're going to see a video from a woman who is a sort of an ethical egoist, and she'll address some of these issues of what is the relationship, or what do we owe others if we take this mantle of what's moral is what's in your self-interest, right? Your own happiness, your own ends are your highest moral principle, right? I think it's a very good critique to say, okay, let's assume that ethical egoism's true. What's moral is what's in my best interest. I still don't know how to find out what's in my best interest, right? Like, I don't know if going to college is yet. I don't know if marrying this person is in my best interest, or if this actually is the career I should go into. Maybe it's a career that's lucrative and I'd like to, but it's going to give me cancer in 10 years because, the x-ray machines and TSA checkpoints are just abysmal, right? Or whatever it is. Not that that's a real thing. You'd have to fact check that. That still doesn't disprove it. It just says it's difficult to figure out what's in your best interest. Some things are pretty clear, right? Exercise, nutrition, saving, not spending more than you have. These are pretty clear-cut stuff, unless you're the government, in which case becoming bloated and overspending just means you get a bigger budget next year, perhaps. But many things, should you always tell the truth? Hard to say. As a good general rule, probably. But if we determine it by this, we have, okay, I have to plug this in. Does this moral theory actually justify violations on other people's rights, slavery, murder, assault, theft, similar to cultural relativism, which as a moral theory says something's moral if the majority of the people agree to it? And so great atrocities and genocides, if the majority of the citizenry support it, does that make it moral? Most of us would say no, it doesn't make it moral, even in those cases. And so again, in this case, if it's actually in a person's self-interest to murder, to enslave, to steal from others, if they can get away with it like Glaucon's man, would that make it moral and proper? Doesn't seem like it. So, an ethical egoist who we'll listen to would have to account for how this theory, ethical egoism, actually doesn't allow for the justification of violation of other people's rights. That's not actually in the individual's best interests to be able to do that. Or, in order to universalize it, you have to say, right, my right to pursue my own self-interest requires me in allowing other people the right to pursue their self-interest. Yeah? And the same thing for the breaking of laws, right? To a certain extent, this self-interest argument is similar to Glaucon's argument for the unjust person, right? It's just determining what's actually in our self-interest. It's tough. But hopefully that makes sense. Homework will be a video from a woman who took this theory and really expanded upon it. And it'll be selfishness versus selflessness. So stay tuned for that.